Ladies and gentlemen, Max Neill.
Hello everybody. It's great to be here. It's a wonderful, wonderful city. And if I seem a bit distracted or odd, I might be a little bit jet lagged. I had a race with the sun around the planet yesterday, and the sun won. So it was fun. I'm here to talk about conflict, and I think everybody here should have encountered conflict at some point in the work. Is there anybody here who hasn't? No. Because what we're doing, we're trying to change the culture of whole organisations, of services, and of individual people, the way that people think. Trying to change the way that services that have usually, you always thought about what worked best for services, how to make them work for the person. We're thinking about risk, we're thinking about the fact that people who people really care about can take risks and maybe do things in a different way than they did before, and that can be a reason for a conflict. We're telling organisations that always used to be run from the top down that they should be involving the people that use the service, they should be involving families, they should be having co-production, and that's a big conflict. It's a huge culture change that some people just can't get their heads around. So there's hundreds of reasons why any person-centred work creates conflict, and just the fact that we're creating change creates conflict, because there can't be change without conflict. It's part of everyday life, it's part of reality for people. So if we go out and do person-centred work, practice person-centred practices, and we don't encounter conflict, then we're not doing it right. So it's part of how we work, it's part of what we do. And I'm not talking to you today about conflict resolution. We want to use the energies created by conflict as a way of pushing forward positive change. We don't want to pretend that you can solve conflict or make conflict disappear, because that's not possible. That's a false promise. I don't think we should be making false promises. We're not going to make everybody happy. We don't have magic wands. We can help people plan, we can help people think together. We can help people think together. Is that better? So we're not setting out to resolve conflicts. And we've got people think of conflict as being dangerous, as being like fire, but it's the same fire that's at the engine of that car that turns it into a really powerful way of moving people from one place to another. So conflict can be dangerous, it can be harmful, it can be a real source of energy and power. I want you to think for yourselves about a conflict that you've been involved in, that you're actually glad that you've had, that led to a positive change for you. I was talking to somebody the other day who, for the first time in her life, told me about having an argument with her sister, basically saying no to her sister, because the sister really took it for granted and put it on her. And for the first time in her life, she said, no, I'm not going to do that for you. I've heard a month, it was a really horrible relationship between them. But eventually, things worked through, and we've got a new relationship now. They see each other in a different way. She doesn't feel put upon in the same way. More respect than her because she stood up for herself. Has anybody got an example of a conflict like that that led to a positive outcome for you? Put your hand up if you think it was. Nobody here has ever had any conflicts that they're glad to put their hand up. One over there at the back. There must be something here. Okay.
In the learning marketplace that we had earlier about organizational change, we talked a little bit about what hadn't worked. We decided to be I'm really glad we had a conflict we had about 10, 12, 13 years ago in our agency, because it really moved us forward to embrace pursuit-centered thinking. So I'm very happy there was a lot of cynical discontent from some of us realized what we needed to do differently.
Anybody else?
We just turned the fans off also to see if that was helpful. It was really overhead noise. Might have made it harder to hear Max as well.
We've dealt with a lot of conflict as family members because we had a different vision for our son than a lot of the school professionals had, or even some of our service provider professionals had, and it wasn't comfortable, you know, because we were asking for things that they hadn't done before and that they didn't think were appropriate or right. So it wasn't comfortable. I used to say silent alarm bells used to sound when I approached the elementary school building. And I was a nice person, but I had a different vision. And as time went on, and we didn't resolve the conflicts. They still didn't always agree, but we came to an understanding that this was our vision, this is how we were going to move forward. And in the long run, I think it was really a positive thing for all of us. And he has amazing outcomes because of it.
I think that's a story that's very resonant in the UK. You talk to lots of family members and they're telling us that they see the whole life as being a struggle for the person that they love, being a struggle to get even very basic things. So the whole life seems like a conflict. Any other stories about any big or small conflicts that you've been involved in, that you're glad you got involved with, that led to a positive outcome for you?
Well, my daughter, growing up, when she was 13 or 14, I had a lot of conflict with her. And it took me looking at the conflict in a different way and resolving it with her to now have a stronger relationship with her. So in that case, the conflict was horrible to start off with, but at the end it led to a much closer relationship.
So as families change and grow, conflicts happen, relationships change, and as progress goes on. Somebody put their hand up over here.
I had a conflict with a supervisor that ended in me leaving a job. Some of you know about that story, but at the time it was very, very painful, and but it led me to a whole new arm of my career and impacting families and people with disabilities in a very different way. So in retrospect, it was painful, but I'm very glad it happened.
So sometimes we have to bite the bullet and make a stand, maybe make a big change in our lives in order for things to go forward. And that's part of what conflict is about. And conflict's important because Dewey said this. He said, conflict is the gadfly of thought. It's something that sets us at noting and contriving. It makes us think of new things to do, makes us think in new ways. It forces us to think. And we're living in a culture and a system where people try not to think. Organisations seem to do their best not to think. They like to work in autopilot. A lot of what we do in everyday life, we work in autopilot because it's easier than having to think and having to change. And conflicts can be something that forces us to think. And person-centred thinking is trying to use that. It's trying to use the fact that we need to get together and think sometimes. So if it's something that forces us to think, it's a positive force. So what I'm talking today is going to be about the limits of what we're talking about as well. And I had a big discussion with Julie Mallett about this. She was brilliant at facilitating over the internet, which is very hard to do when you're talking in FaceTime. The tools that we're going to share, the skills that we're going to share, are about everyday, ordinary conflicts, everyday niggles, everyday things that happen in everyday life, rather than about really huge conflicts that have gone so badly that you need some kind of professional conflict resolver, like a policeman, like a counsellor, lawyer, soldier, United Nations peacekeeping forces. That's out of the remit of these tools. That's a different thing. This is about helping people who are dealing with change in their own lives, who want to think harder together. It's about thinking about our own gifts and skills and what we bring to conflict. And it's about being aware of our own danger zones, the things that our own limits in conflict as well, but we need to know that. It's also about seeing each other in new ways and learning to respect each other. I think you were talking about that with your daughter, about seeing your daughter in a new way and her seeing you in a new way as she grew older. And that's part of life going forward. So that's the sort of limits of things. We're not going to teach you to be professional conflict resolution people. It's about using tools to deal with everyday conflicts better so that they don't turn into massive conflicts that require the need for the police to get involved or social services to come in with a safeguarding procedure or something like that to happen. So, we thought earlier on about the positive conflicts in life. I'd like you to talk on your tables with each other about what you think the differences are between those positive conflicts that have led to some kind of positive outcome for you and the negative conflicts that we all experience so often as well. What is it that makes the difference between a conflict that helps us move forward and those conflicts that gets bogged down, that end up harming us or harming the people around us? So just talk on your table with each other and have a think about the difference between those two things. You've just got 2 minutes to do that. Okay, have to cut you short, we've got much time. Are there any tables where somebody hasn't spoken yet from that table? We want to talk a bit about the difference, what makes the difference for them between a positive conflict and a conflict that needs negative outcomes or harm. So, anyone want to talk about that?
We talked about a lot about the negative piece, but the listening. So if you're not listening, you get stuck in the not even listening to yourself, not even listening to the other person, and you become territorial. And we were going like this while we were talking about it. And Mary Beth noticed the emotion, right? So there's emotion involved. So the positive is if you actually stop and listen to what you're thinking and explore what's it really about for me, but then what is the other person saying? Then it can change.
So thinking a bit about what's important to both of you. Yeah. And somebody over here have the hand up. Yeah.
Going into conflict with an open mind is very important. If you already have your mind set, even if you listen, but your mind is really set on only your resolution, that can definitely have a negative turn. So being open to the other person's point of view.
Okay. Any others?
I think one example I was talking about at our table was just making sure everybody who needed to be at the table was at the table, so that there wasn't any one person missing, so we could have this really honest conversation. And then starting out with something positive round. Everything that we appreciated about 2 entities that were there, and that really set a great stage for solving the conflict.
Brilliant. And another little question. At times when you're stuck in a very negative conflict that seems to be damaging and harmful, or could be getting that way, are there ways that it could be turning into a more positive conflict? What can we do that would help transform a negative, damaging conflict into a more positive conflict, to make it more likely to have a good outcome? So just have a thought about that for a second.
Listening to them
I do that on the phone sometimes if there's a family member that has an issue with somebody I serve, like a service quitting, and get all those things out ahead of time, and then they float up their steam, and then once we get together, we can get more matter-of-factly and maybe more questions to really tease out what's going on and not focus so much on the negative.
So that's really interesting, thinking of importance in the flow. So what do I want out of this conflict? What's important to me in this? Also, what's important to the other person? And what will keep us both healthy and safe? What will help us both avoid harm during this conflict? So that's really interesting. Anybody else, any thoughts on avoiding or getting out of negative spirals and negative conflicts? What's worked for you?
I think having the setting be a real low, not in a place that increases the tension level, but someplace where someone feels safe to express their ideas without feeling that they're going to be judged or they're going to have to give something up. So they're not building walls during the working out.
So there you're thinking like a facilitator about creating a safe space for you, a safe space for those other people. And it seems easier to do as a facilitator than it is in your personal life, isn't it? Yeah. Any other ways of helping lift that conflict?
I think that when things get really heated, at least for me, stepping away for a moment and depersonalizing and really thinking about what's frustrating that other person, because sometimes what's coming out as anger and frustration is really rooted in fear and uncertainty and not being heard and feeling disempowered. So stepping back to actually take a second to think about that stuff.
Yeah, I think stepping back's really important. And think about our own role in conflict as well, how we might be actually adding to it or contributing to it. When I first started out work, I was a direct support worker. We used to help somebody have a bath. He could actually do a lot more than he would do, so we were trying to help him learn to scrub his own back. But he could only push himself far if he didn't want to do it. And I just stepped over that line and jumped out of the bath and chased him down the stairs. And I was stood at one end of the room and he was stood at the other end. He was shouting at me and I was stood there. I actually suddenly had that experience of stepping outside the conflict. And I thought, I'm quite big and I look quite big and strong and I'm stood square onto this man. What will happen if I sit down? So I actually sat down. And as soon as I sat down, he sat down, and the conflict finished. We started talking properly, and it's just really interesting how my change in my body language affected him, and so he took the heat out of that situation. He got in back in the bath and finished off the bath, and I've always remembered that as something quite powerful. But how we contribute. If you don't notice that, it leads to a zigzag spiral that goes up, getting worse and worse. So, conflict is inevitable. It's part of everyday life, but it doesn't have to turn into combat. It doesn't have to be that damaging. And actually having a different attitude to conflict is quite important, because if we always fear conflict, and in Britain, I don't know if America's the same, but I think it probably is, we're all very, very fearful of conflict. We're very scared of getting into an argument with people. And the consequence of that is that we will spend weeks, months, years avoiding conflict, getting more and more frustrated, things not being said. British are famous for the politeness and not saying what they mean, and we're very good at that. So frustration builds up, teeth get gritted, everything gets more and more frustrated until eventually something has to be said, and and we say it in the wrong way, we do it wrong, we handle it wrong, and it results in damage to either one or both parties and lots of things being frustrated. So having a different approach to conflict, where you feel more confident that you can handle conflict, can avoid that really negative spiral, because you can get it out in the open and deal with it and change that relationship rather than letting that frustration happen. So we need to get more skilled at conflict and less fearful of conflict, especially when we're working in everyday life with people who try to implement change. So I want you now to imagine that you're in a situation where there's likely to be some kind of conflict, a big argument maybe. People have been saying this meeting's going to lead, there's been a big argument going up at this meeting. So just think about some kind of situation where you're likely to be in conflict. Maybe it's a family situation, maybe it's something at work. But just think, what skills and strengths you personally bring to that situation? So what are your particular skills and strengths when it comes to conflict? And also think about what support you might need from other people when it comes to a conflict. So just maybe write down on a piece of paper in front of you what you yourself would bring to a conflict and what support you need when you're part of that conflict. So what would you help me say? What would people around you help me say? Any thoughts? What are your particular skills in this conflict?
What I was thinking was that it works for me to just be able to say right out loud, right away, there's an elephant in the room and we need to talk about it, rather than waiting, because if it just helps me get my confidence up. If I start right in, and it can be like, we really need to talk, or I know you're not going to like to hear this, or there might be something leading up, but I try to just say it and before I lose my nerve.
So your skills saying what you know needs to be said here.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great skill. Is there any support you need to do that from other people?
I guess that if I'm concerned about safety, I want to make sure that there's somebody who knows that I'm doing it, and that there's a backup someone.
So just having somebody around when you pop a dangerous question, yeah. So someone over here.
I've been practicing what we call a know-nothing stance when we go into a meeting where there's going to be conflict. Our organization has done a lot of strategic planning in the last year, and there's a lot of conflict around that. And so we have agreed, which is the support, that judgment can wait. And so we just put everything aside and try to talk about the facts as best we can.
Being non-judgmental is one of your key skills. And when you're faced with a conflict, is there anything that you want from other people around you?
I do like to ask, what else could it mean? That's the question that I like to ask.
So, brilliant.
I think something I bring to a conflict positive is that I'm a calm person and having a calming effect on the conversation, and listen well and can summarize well. The support I need is for the other person to have a willingness to listen and to not yell at me.
So, I'm interested in this support part where maybe you know you're going to be part of a conflict, you're going to bring something good to it, but what support would you need from other people?
For me, I need people to kind of know my threshold. I let people know with my body language that I need a break. So I need people to support me by recognizing when that's coming from me and recommending that we need to step back for a moment.
Anybody else? So people around you are really aware of your limits, and there's a very clear person centered thinking too that might help with people around you with that, isn't there? You know, so a one-page profile, I think, is a really good way of recording some of the information that we get here. I think one thing that I notice when I do this with people is that you'll get some people say I'm very calm, I'm good at listening to people, I can debrief people afterwards by sitting and letting them cry on my shoulder, and other people say I'm somebody who can let people cry on my shoulder, or I'm very good at listening. So often you get in a team, the complementary skills where people have what they need if they're in a group to face conflict together that they might not have when they're on their own. And I think the one-page profile is a great tool for that. This is to just a few questions for when you're in one of those meetings where the conflict just seems to break out of nowhere. And 5 questions. And the first question is, what do we agree on? And sometimes you need to take a lot of steps backwards to actually get to what we agree on. A really interesting example where this was used, and it was a situation that was almost on the edge of being one of those where you would actually need professional conflict resolvers, really. It was someone who was cared for by a foster family, but they and the person's real family, or the genetic family, were in a conflict with each other with the service about who the service should listen to, and the service had to get them all together. And that was the first question that they asked us. Well, actually, there's been this terrible disagreement going on between you for such a long time, but what do you actually agree on? What are the things that you really find fundamental? We went right back to, well, we both care about this person. We both want the best of this person. And they were able to agree on that to start off with. The next question, which you can't see, says, what do we disagree on? So let's put down absolutely clearly the things where we actually do disagree. The next question is, what can we live with? So we might not have to agree on it, but we can live with it. We can live with the fact that this exists, this conflict. And this particular 2 couples, they were talking for that length of time. They started to agree on some things that we could live with about meeting arrangements and things like that. And what remains unresolved, that's saying, what's the thing that we still need to think about, what's the thing that we need to carry on thinking about and go further with. And it's absolutely clear we will never think of you as this person's real family. This is our line in the sand. And sometimes you need to know those things, even if you can't solve them, it stays there. And as I said before, this isn't about necessarily resolving every issue, getting clear about what we can live with, finding a modus operandi, sort of a way of living together. So, and then there's a bit of action planning. What do we need to do next? How can we go forward so that this conflict doesn't wreck everything? How can we go forward so that this person can have a good life and can get all the things that we agree on and live with? Does that make sense? What's working, what's not working is an absolutely brilliant conflict tool. It's wonderful for conflict. Anybody want to explain why it's so good for conflict? Lots of trainers in here who train people at work and not working.
It's so great because you get to break down what you know and say, okay, well, at least this part is working, but so maybe even though the entire thing isn't working, at least this part is, and how do we get this part to work?
Brilliant, thank you. Any other reasons why working, not working is a brilliant conflict tool?
I think the most important part of the working, not working is to get everyone's perspective out there. And that's one of the most important parts of working through the conflict.
So,
the other thing this is good for the conflict is that you may have
allows them to get themselves to where the real issue is, and you don't have to have any judgment or any correction or anything along the way. They figure it out for themselves, and then you get to a point where you can come together and really resolve what the issue is.
One of the things that I learned about what's working, not working, my very first aha moment was actually using it in my personal life, and the idea behind understanding what was important to my daughter, who was involved in working, not working during conflict, was that I realized the things that were important to her that I didn't even understand was part of the equation. I didn't know that she was thinking these things. I didn't know that she was coming from that direction. And by doing that, it changed my whole perspective of how to approach the situation.
Brilliant. Anybody else?
I think it's actually also partly in the language of those words. Working and not working are very neutral. It's kind of like, well, my car ain't working today. It's not, inherently, well, it is negative. Maybe I got this wrong, but where I was going is I think that those terms really keep the bad and, you are horrible and all those really emotionally charged terms from being in the process. The working, not working is very neutral to me, and just the language it uses.
I think one of the things about working, not working, is it actually gives people permission to have different perspectives. It doesn't work unless people have different perspectives. So that's really powerful. I went for a meeting with my son's headmaster a few years ago, because my son hadn't been behaving well at school. And it sent me a letter that said, we want to go and talk to you about your son's behaviour. We want to work with you in partnership to solve this problem together. If you don't come, your son will be excluded from school. And I read this and I thought, this is great, until I got to that last sentence. And I thought, what's going on? This isn't partnership, it's threatening me and my son. So when I went into that meeting, what was the first thing I wanted to talk about was that last sentence. And I have a technique in arguments which has never got me very far. It's called the gramophone technique, where if the person doesn't agree with you, you say again what you said, because it's so obviously reasonable and right that if you say it again, they'll understand you. And maybe the 10th time you say it, they'll understand you. So he wouldn't accept that. He shouldn't have put the sentence in the letter. And I kept saying to him, but I can't work in partnership with you. So we never got, and when we were threatening my son with exclusion, and we never got anywhere. If we'd had this, and you could have written down on the wall, Dad's perspective is that this should be in the letter. He'd have recorded what I said, and seen the recording, and been able to get on to all things that both he and I really wanted to talk about, which was how to deal with this behaviour that was so understood. And a few months later, one of my neighbours got the same letter. It's called Letter 1, where it's letter get away to behaviour. And that sentence had disappeared. So he had listened to me. He wouldn't listen to me in front of me. So that meeting didn't get anywhere, which was a real shame. And sometimes I've been in person-centred reviews where people have said, this is going to be a really tough one because there's going to be a massive argument about this issue. And when people see that they've got a chance to put down what's not working, they write it down, and then they write down all the other things about what's great about the person and what's important to the person. So it's only 10% of what we want to talk about. We want to talk about the other 90% as well. So it works really well for capturing that. It's a brilliant tool for approaching conflicts. I think that's something that all the different person-centred skills and tools have in common, actually. We actually do encourage that recording different perspectives, which is right to the heart of it. This was a really interesting tool that we used. In the UK, people sometimes have personal groups where they can actually employ family members as well as staff. And this man was employing his mother as well as a staff team. And she was going into the house and she was getting really annoyed because the staff team had kept moving the settee to a different place in the living room. And whenever she went, she'd move it back. And whenever they came back in, they'd move it back. And my colleague who was facilitating this person's circle had to deal with this, and she sort of asked the question, where does the person want this settee? So well, you could care less. It doesn't matter to the tool, it doesn't mind whether it's there or whether it's there. But it's caused absolute grief for both for the staff team. It was something that could really, really escalate it. So there's a few other issues as well about where to hang tea towels and whether you should hang weight washing banisters and things like that. And these are all becoming issues that could have made the whole thing just break down. Everybody's dealt with situations like that in everyday life, where they deal with families and people and staff. It's just what people get wound up about. So my colleague took this tool and said, well, let's have a think about what people's core duties are when they're here, where they can use judgment and creativity, and what's not their job. And she split it down the middle, but mom's duties on one side and the staff duties on the other. And they negotiated between each other who was responsible for what. And they actually decided that whoever was on duty at the time could move the furniture where they felt like. The person didn't mind, so it didn't matter what worked best for you. So that's how we used that tool. It actually seemed to work for that particular family, for that staff team. Any thoughts or questions on that? So, I'd just like to ask you to think about any other tools or skills that are in the person-centred toolbox that you think would work well with approaching conflicts in life. But just talk to the person next to you for a minute about any other tools that might work.
The exercise we were doing this morning would be important too, and the presence of important too for you. Helps people to see how often they're getting what they need, and helps see other people's perspective. I was especially applying to a situation with different cultural groups who are having odds over different things.
So using the toolbox that I shared about the different priorities for the different tools, how important they are, whether they're present or not.
And just to kind of piggyback on that, I was thinking that a lot of conflict occurs when you have two people and they both have something that's important to them and they're not feeling as though it's present enough in that situation. So I think that's a great idea to use that tool to really kind of look at how can we make this more present to both of us.
Thank you.
I think all too often we talk about using tools for the people that we support, particularly in the midst of conflict. And what I was able to do with my team members is we started with important to important for the individual and moved on to what's working and not working, but it led us really to what was important to and important for that staff member, that service coordinator, and it really helped put an objective spin on where the conflict was coming from, because then we could do the donut and really work through what was going on, what was hers, what was his, and what she really had control over versus really not your job.
Brilliant, thank you. So this is another interesting tool. This is what's called, we call this the volcano. My colleague Elder Smith made this tool, and it's so full of interesting stuff. Basically, it's got 3 zones. I want you to think for yourself about your 3 zones. So you've got one zone at the bottom, which is the comfort zone, which is the zone where we are functioning in autopilot. So the things we find really easy, unchallenging, the things that we could do all day, every day, without any problems. So there are things we've already learned find really easy and comfortable. The zone, so you're perfectly relaxed, your heart's beating slowly, calm, you're breathing slowly, and there isn't any kind of physiological arousal. The zone above that is the stretch zone. Now this is the zone where your mind is having to do some work. You're having to think. You may be going into more slow thinking instead of working from your gut. You're having to think things through. Maybe finding it's a challenge. So think about things that challenge you a little bit. It can be fun, it can be good to be in the stretch zone, but it's also the zone where we actually learn things. When we're training people, we practice lifting people up into the stretch zone because I was trying to get them to learn things. So we're having to challenge them a little bit. We try not to go into the danger zones, but keep them in the stretch zone. Being in the stretch zone for too long can push you into your danger zone. So as a trainer, you bring people up into the stretch zone, and then every so often drop them back down into the comfort zone. Find ways to do that. So think of things that stretch you, find challenging, quite interesting often. At the top, they can be a bit alarming, but you know you're just about to get into your danger zone. So your heart is beating faster, you're having to focus your attention. Maybe it takes single-mindedness to think about these things. The danger zone is when things get overwhelming. There's too many different things that you're trying to think of at once. Issues that you find really, really personally difficult to deal with. Real kinds of different issues there. So have a think about your 3 zones and what would go in each of those zones. About 2 minutes to put down 1 or 2 things in each of those zones. Okay, managed to get something in each of the zones. We've only a few minutes left, so I want to push you fast through this one. The next question to ask is, with the things that put you in your danger zone, when the things that are in your danger zone, what helps move you back down? So that helps you move back down from your danger zone into your stretch zone or your comfort zone. So are there things that other people can do, or that you can do yourself, that pull you out of that danger zone and bring you back down? So have a think about those particular techniques or tactics that you use or other people can use to help get out of that danger zone and back into a safer zone. Everyone understand that question? So you're about 30 seconds to think about it. What pulls you out of the danger zone? Back down to stretch. Anybody willing to share what they do or other people can do to pull them out of their danger zone into one of the safer zones?
I think by having someone to bounce ideas off of and talk things through with me helps me to be more comfortable with the situation. You know, if I'm kind of freaking out about something and I have somebody that I can just share it with, that helps me.
So having somebody around to talk to and let you offload all that stuff onto them, be a shoulder to listen to.
Yes.
Anybody else?
Using the diver's rules, was sharing at this table that my personal situation is when I get into the danger zone when I got to say no, when I need to say no, and what other people can do to support me with that is to do a reality check with me. Let me know you can't handle all of that all at once. So that helps me a lot when you really do real with me and say, oh, you can't do that. You can only do so much. And I can step back, take a look at that, and reflect on it and make the choice in terms of what I'm going to do.
So I think people around you really know what your limits are and
right.
willing to protect them.
Right.
Your willingness to do things for them. And you've got people who say they like to have someone to listen to. Other people like to go off by themselves and just spend half an hour or an hour on their own to come down. So lots of different techniques. So thinking about how you fit into each of those different zones, where your danger zones are, and knowing that is really important when you're entering conflict situations. It's knowing when it's time for you to step out of that situation, knowing when maybe things are getting too much, you're not thinking clearly, your heart's beating too fast, you're breathing too heavily, you're starting to sweat and perspire. All those things are happening. You need to be aware of that and step out. And knowing that itself is really key in conflict, because it's being able to step out of that conflict, being one who can de-escalate that conflict by de-escalating yourself. Last of all, I want to try a little bit of mindfulness. So I'd like you to get into a position where you feel very comfortable. So maybe put your feet on the floor and cross the legs. So get into a position where you do feel comfortable. Not too hot, not too cold. I'd like you to stop talking now. And shut your eyes and just be really quiet. So you're in a position where you're very comfortable, you've got your eyes shut, you're being very quiet, the people around you are being very quiet. What I'd like to do now is focus on what's happening outside this building. Anything you can hear, anything that you can sense. And now bring that focus attention closer in, so into what's happening in this room now. All the people around you, things you can hear and sense, other people around. Now bring the focus in even closer. So bring it into your table. So the people on your table, the noises you can hear, everything that's actually on your table. And now bring your focus into the soles of your feet. And let that focus rise up your legs, through your calves and through your thighs, to below your belly button. And in a moment I'm going to ask you to take 3 deep breaths. Very slow, gentle deep breaths. So take 1 deep breath, and while you take that breath, I want you to about a conflict that you've been involved with the person that's close to you. So take 1 deep breath. Now, I want you to take another deep breath and think about what's important to that person. Now take another deep breath and think about what you like and admire about that person. Finally, take 1 more deep breath and think about what person healthy and safe. And now, at your own pace, just do what happens to you. Open your eyes, start breathing more. Anybody want to share a bit about anything they experienced while they did that when it felt? How did that feel with you? Everybody's too chill to answer.
I like the idea of combining a physical experience with sort of an intellectual process of thinking about the important too. That was interesting.
Anybody else? How did it feel for you?
I think I fell asleep.
Very chilled, yeah. Until I kicked you, then you woke. Okay, so anybody else, any other experiences there?
I think there was something about combining the physical with the intellectual, as you just said, that allowed me to very quickly hone in on what was important to that person. I mean, it was just like really instant, more instant than usual.
Any other final impressions? That was a very short mindfulness exercise, and when people do mindfulness training properly, they do it for a full day or a full week before they get any results at all. So it won't work for everybody in the room by any means. I've got people that did work for, I've got it work for you, and it's something that really you need to practice and do a lot, do it regularly to really get the full sense of how it works, which I recommend. So that's really the end of that presentation. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me, and I hope that you feel able to approach conflict more positively in the future and have some ideas about how you can apply person-centered thinking skills to those conflicts.